Norm Cummings, a member of the board of the Milford Historical Society, and we're here today with Flora Quammie as part of our oral histories for our Black Experience in the Milford exhibit, which is going to open in December of 2021. And hopefully many of you will get to see that, experience it, stop by to our museum. Flora, welcome. It's nice to have you here. Thank you very much. Flora is, as I said, a native of New Milford. She was born in 1952 in what was then the new New Milford Hospital on Elm Street. And she has 5 older siblings, none of whom were born in the New Milford Hospital, but they were, the eldest two, Florence and Gerald, were born in New York City and moved with their parents to Sherman when they were young. And eventually they graduated from Milford High School over on East Street. And then they were, a few years passed, and then 4 more Quammies came along, Edna, Joseph, Quentin, and Flora, and they were all born in New Milford, Flora being the only one who was born in what is now the Milford Hospital. Is that correct? I think it must have been, because Quentin would be, the hospital opened after he was born, pretty sure. And they all attended New Milford schools, starting at the Little Red Schoolhouse in Northville, except for Flora, who started at Main Street School along the Green in New Milford. It's now known as the Richmond Citizen Center. And she is still active in town. I'll explain about her long career here, doing various jobs. But she volunteers at the Senior Center, at the Community Culinary School, and she's very active, as she's been for many, many years at the St. John's Episcopal Church. And she graduated from New Milford High School in 1970, and along the way, while she was at New Milford High School, one of her highlights was being an actor in The Mouse That Roared, which was way back when, even back then, for those of you who know about the Milford High School's strong theater program, even back then the school put out a pretty good school play. She was soon well known and respected as an employee of Morey's IGA, which was a popular family grocery store. For those of you who've been around the Milford for a long time, certainly would remember it. And she worked there for many years while it was operated from East Street, where the CVS is now. And she also worked at the Milford Orthopedic and the Chiropractic Center of Torrington before beginning what became a long and really interesting career with the U.S. Postal Service. She started that in 1987. She worked first in Washington Depot for a year or thereabouts, and then came to New Milford, serving as a clerk for 9 years. She then began an 18-year tenure as a carrier, along the way getting to know people in New Milford as few have done. And I've learned before this interview that she pretty much knows almost everybody's address, at least anybody who is still living here before she recently retired. She's served in numerous church roles at the St. John's, and she's currently busy several days a week at both the Senior Center, and she also does the culinary school volunteer work. So she's a busy woman in retirement at age 69, and we're very pleased and appreciative to have you here to offer your thoughts on your experiences in New Milford from the perspective of a young Black woman who grew up here as a child, had different experiences than some of our other interviewees who moved here when they were children. So thank you, Flora, and welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, to start out, just so for people who aren't familiar with the Quammies at all, can you give us a brief history of the Quammies? And I've mentioned the names of your siblings, but what the family's ancestry is. Do you know anything beyond your parents?
Well, my brother Joseph has been working on the family tree, and he found like the records when my father entered the country from Barbados. He entered through Ellis Island, but my mother was born in New York. Her family was from this area. And my oldest brother and sister, Florence and Gerald, were born in New York City. And the family moved to Sherman at probably the mid to late 30s. They worked for Frank and Alice Evans at Estwick House in Sherman. And then my brother and sister were very active in all the activities in Sherman, and then they went to New Milford High School, graduated from New Milford High School. And then they moved to New Milford in the, it was before 1946, because I know my sister Edna was born in New Milford. And they had lived on Elm Street Extension, and then they moved to Northville. And the rest of us grew up in Northville. We all grew up in Northville.
On Big Bear Hill.
Big Bear.
Okay, for those of you who don't know New Milford, it's right in the heart of Northville, and beautiful area. And back when you were a child, you were basically out in the wilderness almost, because the town was about 5,000 or 6,000 people, and almost all of them were right in the town.
Yeah, there was, it was like, I mean, it was silent and dark, and that's when Route 202 was Route 25.
Right.
It was before the firehouse was built.
Yeah.
But there was the Northville General Store.
Yeah.
That was the happening place.
That's pretty cool. How might your early childhood experiences in town, especially as a young black girl, have affected how you perceived New Milford, its authority figures, police, teachers, people in the church, and your fellow school students and friends while you were growing up? That's a mouthful, but basically, if you can perceive how your thoughts of growing up around here would have been different than your white friends, and I know you had a lot of them.
I don't know that it was different, because we lived in the sticks. I wasn't in town. You know, you came into town, and at the time my mother didn't drive, so you came into town to do shopping on Friday, or but all my friends were in Northville.
So your interaction,
because you met them on the school bus.
so the kids you played with when you were kids, I don't know how far you had to go to do that, and where your neighbors were, but do you remember any differences, any anecdotes or any experiences that, because you were black, and were there any other blacks living up in that area?
In Northville, no.
So do you remember any kind of incidences or any times when it made any difference that you were black or white?
No.
You're fortunate, that's a good thing.
But I think because the way growing up in Northville, you played outside, we were in the woods, and you played, and because my brothers were older, they could walk on the road, they could go to their friends' homes, who lived nearby. But no, it was just growing up in the country.
A segue to you being the youngest member of the family, what was it like being the youngest member of a family where your Edna and Joseph and Quentin were all popular, well-integrated people in the town community, in the school community? What was it like for you being the youngest? Was it a hurdle or was it a help?
Well, I think at first it might have been a little difficult, but then they realized that I was a piece of cake, because I came after my two brothers. I mean, they weren't really wickedly bad, but they were mischievous. But they were also involved in sports. They had a lot of, friends. And so I think that, and by the time I got to high school, they were gone. So I really...
There was 3 years difference between
Yes.
them.
See, so I was pretty much in school by myself.
Right.
So that kind of made it a little easier.
Okay. So you had your own place, your
Yes.
own stature as a growing person, adolescent, teen. What was it like as a teen? Now, I know it has to have been different for you being in a school where there were other black kids, males and females, and there were other towns nearby like Danbury where there were a lot more blacks. To be social, did it occur to you, or did you need to go elsewhere to hang out with friends, or did you just feel like you had your white friends and that was the way it should be?
I had my friends because most of us had been together since first grade. I mean, let's face it, there weren't a lot of people in New Milford at that time.
No, there weren't. Yeah.
My older sister lived with her family in Danbury. Her children grew up in Danbury, graduated from Danbury High School. But no, because as a teenager, you had your school friends, and then of course, you got your license, you got to call you a job, and we just would get together, with friends, like with your sister Lisa and Chris Morey, Sarah Finch. We just all kind
To
of
clarify, my
together.
sister Lisa was in Flora's class at school, so that's
And we were in Girl Scouts. Oh, that was another big thing. We were in Girl Scouts together. So, and I think too that by the time I got to high school, or when I turned 16, we're in the 60s. So it was kind of
different than it had been in the 50s.
Yeah.
Very,
And see, being
so how do you mean related to you?
I think that people, when I look back on it now, I think we were kind of a lost generation, a lost age, because we were too young for any of our classmates to go to Vietnam or to Woodstock. So we were kind of in between being responsible and being kids. We were allowed to be kids.
Which was a benefit.
I think so.
Grew up in a maybe a little more cloistered environment, but certainly one that you felt comfortable with.
Yes, because I think we were rather sheltered because of just that 1 or 2 year age difference.
So you never felt when you were in school, you were in classes with teachers, with going to dances, doing anything, interacting with people in school, never was any issue as far as you being Black?
No, I think a lot of that is because we all grew up here.
Yeah.
Together. And so the differentness, the otherness, wasn't as apparent because you just grew up together.
Okay, thank you. Did you think when you were in school about what Black life, did you talk to your parents about it, or Edna? I don't know whether maybe Joe or Quentin might have said something to you, but when you were like 8 years old, 12 years old, 16 years old, were you aware of what was going on in the world? Did you know what racism was about? I mean, you were, it sounds like clearly you were fortunate and had a good upbringing in Milford, but were you aware of what was going on elsewhere?
I don't think so. I've been struggling with that, trying to figure out if what I know now I knew then, or is it because of what I've learned? I think my clearest memory of the world was when Kennedy was assassinated.
Which would have been when you were 14 years old.
Yeah, that is really I think that would be my first.
No, you would have been 11 years old.
No, wait.
11 years
yes,
old. Yeah.
That was my first, the beginning of my awareness that there was someplace outside of New Milford. You know what I mean? And that bad things could happen. Up until that point,
So moving along a couple of years from then, Martin Luther King Jr. I won't speak for you and say that you would have known or wouldn't have known, but Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, some very prominent Blacks who did a lot of wonderful things to advance the cause of Blacks, some violently in some ways, but Stokely Carmichael, there were just so many role models for young Blacks to use as they chose. Were you aware of them?
I don't think so. I think just peripherally from hearing the names on the news, but I never could equate my life to theirs because I lived a sheltered life. And that's why I've tried to figure out when I first learned of them, and I don't know. because now you know too much, that you've read, you've had the opportunity to read, or I've had the opportunity to read about them and to know what was done.
We have to remember when Flora was growing up, in her teens, all this was going on. You had newspapers, but depending which newspapers and whether you read them, and I'll ask you actually as a follow-up question, what in your school classes, in your history classes, were you taught anything about Black relations or in the United States, or anything about Black history in the United States, other than the fact that, the cliche that, certainly was a major role, but slavery was
Right.
caused of the Civil War. Did you know anything about Black history in the United States?
No.
So that
was
sheltered experience followed right into school.
Right.
The number of people who live in Milford who aren't aware of what's going on is immense, Blacks and whites. And I think, especially back then, there was no internet. We have to remind people looking at this who are under 35 or 40 years of age that there was no internet back then. It's hard to imagine now, but
and there was no 24-hour news.
No.
The news was on at in the morning and in the afternoon and at night, I guess.
Yeah, it was on for like an hour around dinner time, and then we wouldn't be up until the later hours.
But then when you think of it also, through high school and then when you're in your 20s, you don't sit around and watch the news, because who cares what's happening outside of your world?
You don't ever anticipate that it'll ever affect you.
Right.
Through the perspective of the years since you became an adult, and you've actually touched on this already, how's living in Milford helped or hindered your social life? Have you had, without going into details, you can say whatever you want to say, and you can name names if you want to, but have there been times in your life that you felt like you might want to go someplace else, or that you've been frustrated because of being a Black woman in Milford who's well known, but is it been a hindrance to your interaction with with males, females, or anybody else?
I think that in my experience,
and I don't want to get too personal about this, but
in my experience, being Black was never a problem, but being a female was. Because when I was growing up, women didn't have, we were just beginning to have freedoms, or to be able to do whatever and have a choice of what you wanted to do. I had one instance when I was in Morey's, and I was the manager on the day, and this man had a problem, and he did not want to speak with me because I was a female. He wanted a man.
And it wasn't anything having to do with your race.
Oh no, it was the gender. It was. I think I've encountered more of a gender issue than skin color.
It's interesting. It's very interesting, actually, and it's a nice tribute to New Milford, the fact that was not we're doing this to show what people's experiences were in New Milford, and if it's a positive you've had living here for your life, that's a nice tribute to New Milford, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. As I think I said, I lived a sheltered life. I think living in New Milford, you were sheltered, but on the other hand, you weren't, because look at the history that New Milford has. And even, when I was growing up in New Milford, or working in Morey's, I met a lot of celebrities. But it didn't really matter, because you just got used to them coming shopping.
They still needed their food.
Yeah. And so it's really hard to know what it would be, another life. I can't imagine what it would be like.
You said you can't imagine what it would be like, just try for a second now, if you had lived in Danbury, or you lived in Norwalk, or certainly New York City would be a dramatic difference, but if you lived in one of those places, have you got friends who have shared their experience with you that compare notes on what your life's been like here compared to other friends of yours?
No, actually never have done that. And I think that when I look back on it, like when you say, my first thought when you said, suppose you live in Danbury and Norwood, and I thought, ooh, that's the city. You know, I grew up in the country and the sticks.
Yeah.
You know, so that, how my life would be different.
As a young black woman in your 20s or 30s, can you imagine it?
When I was in my 20s, I had thought about moving away, getting a job in the city or something, and then I realized that really wasn't a good time because there were not a lot of openings for females. You either had to be a secretary or primarily, unless you were a nurse or a teacher, you had to be, and that just didn't appeal to me.
So again, the gender issue was a big
Yes.
problem.
I think that was the biggest stumbling block.
Now, I didn't prepare you for this one, but I would like to ask you if you were if you had a young couple who had young kids and they lived elsewhere, they lived in another state, just somebody you were friends with or whatever, and they're a black family, would you say that New Milford would be a good town for them to move to? Now, you've stayed, even though you've lived here your whole life, and you've worked here pretty much your whole working life. So you're very familiar with what it's still like for a black living in New Milford, at least from your experience. What would you recommend that a young family come into New Milford, that it's a good place to bring up a couple of kids in kindergarten age or whatever?
I think so.
Can you expand on that?
I think so, because if you think back to last summer with the Black Lives Matter and the rally that was organized on the Green, and there were a lot of people, black, white, and one comment I heard from someone when they were marching on Railroad Street, someone was screaming at them because they were blocking the street. That's New Milford. I don't know if that's good or bad. It didn't matter if it was Black Lives Matter, whoever.
Yep.
The street was closed,
Right.
And they couldn't get through.
Right.
So I don't know if that is particularly a good thing or a bad thing.
Let me ask you about your friends or your relationship with your brothers especially, or Edna. They've all lived elsewhere, in Carolina, Canada, various other places. Do they ever talk to you about living in New Milford? And have they ever, because I'm sure in their life experience elsewhere, they probably have encountered more experiences in a different way because they're black.
Yes.
Have they ever talked to you about that? Or have you said, well, come back to New Milford, it's good here, or whatever? How do you deal with that? Because I know you have a good relationship with your siblings.
No, I don't really talk about it because I think in a sense we are all so different. Like my sister Edna lives in Toronto. She lives in a huge, humongous city, and she's happy in that. Joseph had lived in a city, but now he's in Nova Scotia, and he's loving it.
Kind of almost going back to the Northville roots.
Yes, yes. And then Quentin is, he had lived in Durham, but he now is moved outside of the city. So I think and I'm sure that they've encountered racism, but I don't think, not to the point of making them bitter or scarring them, they just moved on. I should say they were probably very focused on, like my sister was focused on their careers.
So the credit to your parents probably in a lot of respects, the fact that they prepared all of you to deal with what life brings. Is that a fair thing to say?
I think, yes, because I think we were all raised, we were given the knowledge of how to take care of ourselves. And to be independent. I think the one thing that I do remember is, when you came of age and you got to go out at night, and the one thing my mother would say is, right from wrong. And so it was up to you to make the decision whether you were going to do something wicked or not. And I think that carried through with all of us.
It's great to have great parents.
And plus I was just talking to someone about this. Even when we were growing up, I mean, Bruce Nearing seemed to be like 17 feet tall when you
Bruce Nearing was the town's constable back in the, I think, I'm not sure when he started, should back up a date, like in the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, before there really was much of a police department in Milford. And he wasn't a big guy.
His presence alone stopped you in your tracks.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's an anecdote which I'm sure our viewers who were around in Milford back in those days will definitely chuckle at. Bruce Nearing was a character, and he was somewhat intimidating. Do you have any other thoughts? Anything else that we haven't touched on that you want to bring up? We've gone in a lot of different directions, so.
I think that I've been very fortunate to grow up and to live in Milford. I think it not only is the area pleasing, but I think that the people, I think we're a kind and caring community. And I think we proved it last year during COVID with lockdown, is that we learned I had already always been doing it, but people learned that their neighbors were hungry. I think that opened up a lot of doors and avenues for people, and people who maybe would never have thought of it, but had to ask for help to go get groceries from social services or to get meals. And I think that may have changed the town.
Well, if you don't mind me saying so, touting Flora Quammie, I think it's also a reflection of you as a person. The fact that is what you would remember as being symbolic of the town. The fact you volunteered at a culinary school and at the Senior Center and in your church, you're obviously a good person who wants to do that. I probably should stop this run right now before I give Flora too big a head. But the fact that you were lucky to grow up in a town that also has a lot of other people who care about each other.
Yes. And I think that, at the time when we were growing up, that's what neighbors did. They helped each other. If somebody was sick, mom cooked a meal. I mean, that's what people did.
And your black family had was every bit a part of that as much as anybody else.
Yes.
So again, I use the word tribute. It's wonderful for New Milford to have that.
And you think too, when growing up, and especially growing up in Northville, there were farms, and everybody had gardens, and it wasn't. So I can't imagine growing up even in town, because that's what you did. You had your garden, and you played in the woods. It was just great. And I can think of one time. I don't know if your sister was involved in this or not, but we would do things like go tobogganing at night in the dark.
This may have to be edited. No, keep going. I'm sure Lisa would love to hear this.
We would go tobogganing or go out sledding at night in the dark. What were you thinking?
Well, there weren't street lights a lot of places.
No, but it was also safe.
Yeah.
It was always a safe place to be.
I wouldn't be surprised if she were involved.
So probably.
Well, Flora, I want to thank you for being here and welcome you to the museum. And we look forward to when we have our opening in a couple months. We would love to have you here for that. But this is all something people are going to be hearing after the fact. But I'm proud and happy for our friendship over the years, and really pleased that you're part of this. Thank you for offering your time and your thoughts.
Thank you. I was a little nervous about it at first. I said, "Oh, what am I going to say?"
And I think I remember saying, you don't need to be nervous.
Yeah.
You're going to do fine. You did.
And I did.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.